Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Wanton people, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, where we are still on our podcast journey sailing throughout the region and its diaspora and having some very interesting and necessary history conversations while we're at it. Not unlike the rest of the world, but particularly for our situation in the Atlantic Ocean and Caribbean Sea, disasters, especially natural disasters, are commonplace. And while we've just grazed the surface many times, particularly talking more so about hurricanes, there are quite a few disasters that have had lasting effects on our islands, our development, and of course, our people. One in particular that stands out to me as we journey to a new island in this episode is the 1948 Castries fire on the island of St. Lucia. Joining us for a very interesting take on this history is Milt Moise, PhD candidate in the Department of English at the University of Florida. Milt, thank you so much for joining us. Why don't you let the people know a little bit more about you, your connection to the Caribbean, and what you do and study?
Oh, thank you so much for having me on the podcast, Alexandria. I really appreciate it. Born and raised in St. Lucia. Although the last few years I barely get home anymore, unfortunately, but that's starting to change again. In terms of my relationship with the country and its history and studying and the Caribbean in general, I went to UWI. I did both of my degrees at UWI. My first degree is undergraduate and graduate. I remember at the time, because my brother studied in England, he did law in England. I really wanted to go to England. So I was bitterly disappointed. UWI seemed like a disappointing second choice. But immediately after getting my degrees, I felt like this was the best thing that could have happened to me because I felt so rooted in my country and my region. And I feel like the opportunities that I learned there and the foundation that I was given to understand my region and then the world was the best thing that could have happened. So I'm really grateful for going to UWI Caville to be more specific in Barbados. And yeah, when you go there, you have to do Caribbean studies more or less. So that's basically what I did, and I'm extremely grateful for it.
Beautiful, beautiful. Before we even dive into the fire specifically, I really find it necessary for us to kind of set the scene a bit for Castries, the city. And so even prior to the 1948 fire, which again, is renowned, Castries had been prone to fires with several occurring since the 18th century. So major fires ravaged the city 1796, 1805, 1813, 1927. But as National Archivist Margot Thomas points out, it was particularly that 1948 fire that St. Lucia really learned the most from, especially because of the extent of its damage. So while, of course, we weren't personally there in 1948, could you describe a bit about what 1940s Castries was like prior to the fire?
Well, 1940s Castries was an interesting place. So it was at this point, it was a crown colony setup. So sort of British colonial outpost, very divided along class lines. Some of the images I remember from Derek Walcott's poetry describing what Castries was like, and you had these high colonial style houses where the upper class, the way he described it, would kind of look down on people who were plying their trade and working. So it was this sort of very small but bustling colonial outpost where people, were just living their lives and doing the best that they could at the time. But again, like you pointed out, the fact that there had been a few fires before then may suggest that, there were some structural issues at play that we had not really addressed or dealt with properly, which led to probably the biggest disaster in the country's history in terms of natural disasters.
So jumping to obviously now 1948, do the whole scene for us. How did the fire get started? What actually happened? I think it's oftentimes described, as I said, as the most destructive of the five main Castries fires. So what were even like the consequences for the city?
Yeah, so apparently the people who did the forensics on it said that it started at this tailor's house, a guy called Adonis, which is how St. Lucians would pronounce it. And it sort of spread throughout the city pretty rapidly. There are all of these apocryphal stories. I remember listening to one account of someone said they went down to the firemen, and they told them, there's a fire going on. What are you guys are playing dominoes. Let's get something done. But unfortunately, all they had was a cot. They had like a cot and some containers of water. So it wasn't really going to do much. And then you just had this situation where the fire kept spreading. And even when they got the main fire out, there were all of these peripheral fires around that kept going for a while. There were all of these accounts of people helping one another. Because, like I said earlier, it was a very divided society. So a lot of people who lived in the city, you had these lower class people who did work for some of the upper class people who ran businesses in the town. And obviously, some of the more well-off folks could not really afford to keep their helpers anymore. And the helpers were like, well, I'll do it for free. There was a sense of spirit and community that emerged after that, I think. I lived in Japan for a few years. I was there during the Tohoku earthquake and the tsunami, and it was a kind of similar situation, I would have imagined, with obviously some looting, which is unfortunate.
So to your point, right, the fire created this sort of massive destruction, I think, different from some of the other fires, which you could maybe point to, oh, this administrative building being destroyed or this administrative being destroyed. 1948 fire like ravaged most of Castries.
Yeah, most of the city was utterly destroyed. I went to St. Mary's College. So there were only two secondary schools in St. Lucia at the time. St. Mary's College, which is the boys' Catholic school, and St. Joseph's Convent, which is the girls' Catholic school. Both of them were in Castries. The fire destroyed both of them. So I only know St. Mary's College as being sort of in a suburb called VG. And then the St. Joseph's Convent was placed a little bit further. So the destruction of the schools were also a major part of that I think sometimes gets lost, because they were literally the only two schools in the island at the time.
So beyond this, community obviously emerging after the fire, what was the national reaction? Or I guess technically we weren't nations at the time. So, but what was sort of the reaction? How did Castries rebuild? Anything that kind of sets the scene for that post 48 moment?
There's a really great image that I found when I was writing about this, of this guy sort of in the foreground. The background is just destruction. It's a black and white photo. And that photo seemed very emblematic of how people felt about it. There was a general sense of despair. People lost a lot. 809 people from the official records lost their homes. So there was a lot of despair and despondency around it. But like I said, there was this sort of the spirit of resilience that emerged and people banding together. Fire is very interesting because, and I'll probably get into this later when I talk about more academic responses to this, because fire offers a chance to rebuild as well. And there was a chance to build Castries. I think it was Obama who said, never waste a good crisis. And I think the people at the time sort of followed that mantra to sort of rebuild Castries in a different way. I remember listening to this account of someone who moved to Barbados. And I think this is something that happens across the region when tragedies happen. But in general, Castries became a much more commercial center. And a lot of the places at the heart of Castries where people live, people don't live there anymore. You just have shops and stores. The Catholic Church was restored and built back. The Castries Roman Catholic Church, the library, the Carnegie Library. But I think that was one of the major outcomes of it. The sort of the exodus of more residential and the sort of more commercial elements, which were always there, obviously, because it's a capital, but I feel like it became more pronounced.
And so we see this, rebuilding, but obviously to your point, it's changing the whole dynamic of what the city once was.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing that I found a little bit interesting, and that I think you were sort of almost getting to in your response, is because of the extent of the damage, right? It's a significant number of people who are affected at this point. And so one thing that I found a little bit interesting was that it sort of helped to decrease the kind of like class distinctions, because a lot of people's, property and things are getting destroyed. What has been your take on that?
Yeah, I remember there's a really interesting documentary about it. And I think that claim came up in the documentary. And I think there is some truth to that, but I'm always a little skeptical of such claims, because I think that these things are momentary, especially back then. I mean, the people who had access to land, even though stuff burned down, they were able to either sell the land that they had or rebuild again. So it was sort of temporary. But I don't want to poo-poo it too much as well, because there are these moments of crisis where people do come together, and maybe previous relationships, previous dynamics, even though it breaks down for just a moment, there may be a little bit of a residual effect that can redound to the society. But it may be a little bit overplayed in the official accounts, as you tend to see in stories of disaster. If you think of things like Katrina and stuff like that, you hear these are narratives that are perpetuated in those moments. And we have to interrogate them a little bit deeper, because some of those boundaries may have been broken down, but they may have been rebuilt as the city was rebuilt.
Right. That would be a whole different conversation, but talking about class and capital and intergenerational wealth is a longer system that, this not to, decrease the impact of the fire, right? But one
Yeah.
fire can't take away all of that.
And I remember there was there was a British warship after a while that came down to help with the rebuilding efforts. So I kind of see that as a symbol, because the people who were there, some of the white St. Lucians who were there and who didn't, you mentioned earlier that it wasn't a nation in the sense that we think of it now. So these people would get the support of the British government, right? So these people would get help to rebuild. But what about the lower classes who maybe had smaller living areas? Who was helping them? Some of them had to leave and go back to the countryside where they lived, or continue to hang around and hope that the people they work for got back on their feet. And some of those accounts aren't as well documented, unfortunately.
So it's been in that same realm of what you're saying, as far as, certain accounts not being fully discussed or even captured. It's been 74 years since the fire. So how has it been remembered? And maybe not in the academic yet, we'll get that,
Yeah,
just sort of
yeah.
like in a community sense. How has it been remembered? How do you think St. Lucia and St. Lucians were as a result transformed?
Yeah, it's one of those things that, how would I put this? It's always in the back of St. Lucian's memories. It's something that is there, but it's not spoken about as much. It's memorialized in the poetry and the fiction, and the documentary that I mentioned, which was a 50th, I think it came out in 1998. So it's a 50th anniversary, sort of looking back, and the oral accounts of all the people who were there. And it often takes on a spiritual tinge when you listen to how people talk about it. Mostly an opportunity for rebirth, an opportunity for sort of reflection, a sort of reconsideration of our history and where we came from and where we are going, that sort of thing. But it's unlike, I think, some disasters that have been memorialized in physical, tangible ways. It hasn't really been around the country as much, in terms of, I can't think of a statue or plaque or anything like that. It's been reflected more in the art, and now with this documentary that's a bit old, that visual medium.
So as we were sort of alluding to throughout this episode, it has been definitely showcased, highlighted in that more creative and academic sense, right? I think one thing that's I've always found so beautiful about the way our histories can be told and the ways to look at history, not even just Caribbean history, but one thing I found so interesting about ways to just learn histories, it's not always in your, sit down textbook, whatever way, right? You can learn about history through art, through culture, through song, etc. And so I'm always looking for those creative works that just, further showcase our history in different ways. And I always ask guests to share these creative works on the theme of each episode. And so to your, glory, and I'll definitely link it in our show notes. You've actually written, I think, a really great article, in my opinion, on two St. Lucian pieces. Of course, on two St. Lucian pieces, a novel or a novella rather, and a poem that discuss the fire and its impact on St. Lucia. So would you mind sharing them, of course, and then sort of what you find most interesting about the differences, how they're reflecting on the impact of the fire, and of course, any other examples that come to mind?
Before I get that, and thanks for your kind words, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of historian Hayden White. He's one thinker that I've done a little research on and used him to help my arguments. And he talks about history as a narrative, right? As a story we tell ourselves. And And the interconnection between history and literature is so rich. And there are times historians will look at the literature to kind of get a sense of what people thought at the time, and vice versa. As the literary scholars, we would look at the history to inform whatever it is that we're talking about. So I did history at A level. My brother wanted to be a historian. He's now a judge. So history is something that's really deep in my family and something we consider very much. And the two works in question are obviously Derek Walker's poem, A City's Death by Fire, and Gavsen Omar's Another Time, Another Place. Derek Walker's poem, it's performed all over the country. I was a secondary school teacher for a while in St. Lucia. We'd have dramatic poetry readings and they would have to recite that poem. So it's a poem that everybody knows. One of the arguments I make is that it was our first national poem. It's just a poem that epitomizes the resiliency of St. Lucians, the ability to build back and band together. And it's announced, apart from that, it announced Derek Walker to the world. It's just this sort of incipient, very important touchstone. And every country has poems or works of art like that, and this is ours. And it was written in 1948, really just after the fire. And you can feel it when you read it. It's very visceral. And you can imagine this young man, Derek Walcott at the time, was born in 1932, teenager walking through, because he lived in Castries. He lived there, so he saw it firsthand. He had to experience just the smell of the smoke and the ash and that the devastation. And then 20 years later, in 1968, you have Gavsen Omar, who he's writing about a bunch of other things, but he mentions the fire. It occupies a really critical place in his novella. But his version of it is completely different to Walcott's. Like Walcott's is, oh, this is really horrible. There's an existential sort of trying to grapple with what happened. But at the end, it's sort of, this is an opportunity for rebirth and renewal, and we will do this. So you understand why it will become the sort of totemic, really important poem to St. Lucians. Whereas in the Gavsen Omar novella, it's the fire is like, this place is rotten to the core. Everyone is aping colonial mannerisms. Class is just this festering wound in the society, and this fire is almost like a condemnation. Burn it all down. So he has a very, very different approach to this. Coincidentally, the protagonist who's enjoying it is called Derek. I think there's he's addressing Walcott directly. And one of the things I lament, and I talk about it in my piece, is that this version of it, of the fire, no one talks about it. Barely anyone ever reads Gavsen Omar. He had a little bit of a revival recently that myself and a friend of mine who's a scholar of his, she especially has kind of, done a lot to redeem his reputation, because I think his ideas are pretty important too. So yeah, you have these sort of dual representations of the fire, and I think it's important to consider both. Because when we sort of create national histories, there may be a tendency to include only the positive. And the country that we both work in and live in has a very, very tenuous relationship with that. But if we're going to actually grapple with conceptualizing this complicated idea of the nation and what the nation means, then we do have to have a sort of more stereoscopic perspective of national disasters and how we respond to it and who was deeply affected by it and how were they affected. And I think just considering these two things in relationship to one another is really, really, really useful. And I try to get people to read the St. Omer novel, even though he can be a pretty brutal, right? He can be pretty harsh. But if you pair them as a dichotomy, I think useful things arise from that.
You make some really great points on trauma that I think, especially in the face of disaster, how we overcome them. And obviously, to your earlier point, Walcott and St. Omer do this in very different ways to an extent. So what are your thoughts on trauma and how it shows up post disaster, but also how it shows up differently in both of the pieces?
Yeah, that's a really good question. With regards to the Walcott poem, you can feel the trauma of the persona, this individual walking through, and like I said, grapples with things in a very existential way. But religion comes in, a spirituality comes in there, and spirituality is used to sort of grapple with trauma and offer a solution to the trauma and a larger purpose, and that's not uncommon. A lot of us as people, spirituality and a belief in a higher power help us through these really difficult moments. Whereas in the St. Omer piece, it's an unfeeling, indifferent world in a way, in a sense. And he's condemning all of these people. And he's kind of looking at the way that they are processing it as rather flawed, at least on the surface. But the fact that he believes that this is almost like a sort of divine intervention, that the city is burning down, it kind of complicates his message a little bit. And like I said earlier, I went through a natural disaster when I lived in Japan. So I saw how people process that national trauma, and I was part of that. So I was able to compare this very different culture to my own culture. And I think of earthquakes in Haiti and how people respond and how the world looks at it in response versus how they responded to Japan. And the trauma is something I realized, and I'm interested in, because in like everything that I've written academically, it's come up apart from my dissertation that I'm working on. So it's really fascinating to me how people conceptualize it and write about it. To write about trauma in the form of a sonnet. A sonnet is a very rigid poetic style. You must have this structure and this structure. It's actually unusual because most people think trauma happens in a very haphazard, circular way, and using a very strict form to represent it is just strange. Modern representations of trauma are a little bit more open, a little bit more fluid. But again, I think Derek Walker was announcing himself on the world stage using the classic English form. So there's that going on there. And there's the post-colonial trauma aspect to these two works of art that underpins them both. And Derek Walker is more positive about our maybe being able to break away from that. I think we're still trying to break away from that. And St. Omer has a much more negative perception. I think he's saying we're not ready yet. We're busy aping the mannerisms and not really ready to look into the mirror and evaluate ourselves. And that's something that as Caribbean people, no matter how different we think we are, we're still grappling with our own fire. Our fire, our national event is colonialism. And I think trying to process our trauma in ways that offer healing and inclusivity, I think, is what we should be doing. But too often, people stoke the fires. Sorry to belabor the fire metaphor in negative ways in terms of politics and religion and stuff like that.
That is, I think, probably a beautiful point to end on. I definitely do agree that it's a very apt metaphor, that colonialism as a fire that I mean, it would take us into a different conversation largely, but even with Haiti, most recent events, etc., these are issues that we're constantly going through. And no matter how many centuries or for other countries, decades, certain islands have been independent. And not all of the islands are independent, of course, but it's something that we still, imperialism and colonialism, neocolonialism is ongoing. And so despite the rebirth that certain fires have brought, like the 1948 Castries fires, there are continual problems that we are still facing, especially as a colonized people and quote unquote formally colonized, depending on who you're talking to.
Yeah. I like your introduction of neocolonialism there, because I think neocolonialism is it lingers in very insidious ways. And I have these discussions with friends and people who are concerned about these things in terms of tourism and how tourism just reproduces those dynamics, that sort of middle passage and the flows of currency and where things go and who controls the means of production and stuff like that. And even the way in which we conceptualize our nations and how we should provide employment for most people. They are very weighty, fraught conversations that we need to have. I think post the fire, for a long time, agriculture was the dominant economic activity in my country. And that's changed. We've gone all into tourism, for better or for worse. And with COVID and tourism being not a thing for a little while, people are still feeling it. So again, all of these things are legacies that still linger, that we're still trying to figure out what we're going to do about them.
Well, thank you. This was a great episode. I really enjoyed learning more about St. Lucia. I will obviously also, as I think I said, link your article in our Strictly Facts syllabus. I think it's literally one that was a pleasure to read and just...
Thank you so much. It's very nice of you to say.
of course, and just really helped set the scene for understanding how Walcott and St. Omar are doing two very different things with kind of one, one subject as the fire. So, as I said, thank you, Milt, for joining. Thank you, listeners, for tuning into this episode. And we hope you enjoyed it. Lickle more, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.